Hello. Our story begins on Exegol. The Dark Lord of the Sith, Emperor Palpatine, in a moment of resistance against Rey and Ben, realized something. The two were a dyad, a power like life itself. He could return himself to his former physical form. Given the nature of the dark side, it was the best he could do for himself. As people from around the galaxy entered Exegol, using a chart laid out by Rey, the Final Order was attacked. Under the leadership of Lando Calrissian inside the Millennium Falcon, and Poe Dameron, using his personal starfighter, the people were quick to fight. The battle ensued as his Ison-class Star Destroyers attempted to defend themselves from the rapidly approaching fleet of people. Inside the Sith Temple, the Dark Lord returned, his robes illuminating like never before. Smoke bellowed out from beneath him as his loyalists chanted out to him in the ancient dialect of the Sith. The noise was so audible, it woke Ben up. He was in pain from the force drain, but he got to his feet. Sidious was so enamored with his return to power, he didn't even need to look pretty. He just had to have the power he couldn't possess within his clone form. His joy turned to a scowl when he turned to see the last Skywalker rise to his feet. With his granddaughter still on the ground, he turned to Ben and lifted him with the Force, suggesting that as he fell, so would fall the last Skywalker, as he launched Ben backwards into a chasm at the back of the arena. His joy couldn't be overstated. The lightning on the planet came alive. The last of the Sith had returned to his truest form of power. He smiled and told his loyalists to not fear this feeble attack. Nothing would stop the return of the Sith. In a short moment, everything was as perfect as could be for his return. Rey could hear the evil laughing as the lightning above her head illuminated the little she could see, and then she heard nothing but silence. She rolled back and spoke out into the Force, asking that the Jedi of the past be with her. It was one of her master's final lessons. But as she called out, she realized that the lightning had vanished. Her eyes looked to her right, and then she saw nothing but darkness. Was she dead? Had she failed? Rey's eyes scanned a little further and she could see walkways, and some portals of some sort. She was unaware of any of this. The Jedi text from Ahch-To held a lot of information, but the Jedi of old hadn't discovered the world between worlds when they were still on Ahch-To. She scanned this new realm as she slowly pushed herself off her back and looked around. She got to her feet and looked behind her. It was endless walkways and portals. They never came to an end, and then she was so confused. Her eyes darted around. As they did, she saw a shadow out of the corner of her eye. When her eyes came back, she saw a man. There was fire in his eyes, and his robes were dark. Initially, upon seeing him, she thought it was Ben. It wasn't uncommon to have an out-of-body experience with Ben, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized that it wasn't him. His hair was lighter, and his robes were more like a Jedi's. Rey could feel the anger from within him. She called out asking who he was, and Skywalker looked at her. She didn't know who he was either. How could either of them know each other? She was 2 years younger than him, and they were separated by nearly 60 years of galactic history. Rey started forward carefully. She placed her hand to her side and felt Leia's lightsaber. She didn't pull it, but she wanted to see what Anakin did. Skywalker started forward at the same time. He wasn't nearly as cautious. Much like Ben, he was significantly taller than her. They closed in but kept their distance until they were a little closer to around a couple paces from each other. She again asked who he was, and he was somewhere between Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader, but he told her his name, Anakin Skywalker. For a moment, he was curious if the daughter had somehow returned or manifested in human form. He asked her how she got here. She shook her head. She didn't know where she was. What was here? He was very close to getting aggravated when 5 voices called out. Both Rey and Anakin turned their heads. Who was that? They're both already on edge, Anakin just a little bit more temperamental than she. Out of nowhere, a couple of faces appeared and called them out by name, requesting them to step forward. Rey and Anakin did as was asked, closing in towards each other. Rey kept looking at Anakin a bit weird, which he noticed but didn't pay any mind to. He needed to get back to Mustafar so he could win his fight and kill Kenobi, and save his wife. Rey, on the other hand, needed to get back to Exegol, but as was consistent with her, she was curious as to what was happening. Her interest to learn leveled with her desire to return to Exegol and finish what she went there to do. The Force priestesses spoke out to the 2 beings of the Force. Both of them were brought into the galaxy to bring and maintain balance in the Force. Both of them had failed in each of their own timelines. The priestesses were going to make a change, one that would maintain the balance of the Force for good. The Force desired peace, but because Darth Sidious was the greatest of the Sith, he was able to cheat death. It may have been an ability only one had achieved, but Sidious had no problem making it too. The priestesses spread out, telling both Rey and Anakin that they were going to be switching timelines. They would have a chance to correct the errors of the other. Once they defeated Sidious, they'd be both brought back to the world between worlds to oversee it and become guardians of the Force. They would no longer be mortal, and they would have to forego their lives, attachments, and memories they built from the very beginning of their lives to their respective great failures. Once they defeated Sidious, they'd become one with the Force. Rey and Anakin looked at each other for a second. Skywalker's rage subsided as he turned towards the priestesses, suggesting that it was unfair of them to do this. They couldn't just do this. One of the priestesses, named Anger, called out to him, telling him that there would be no arguing. All is as the Force wills it. Skywalker sat between confusion, sadness, and rage. He couldn't just let go of his attachments. He refused. The entire reason he did what he did is so that he could save the ones he cared about. As he said that, sadness continued forward and expressed that it was the reason why he failed. The Father had given him a chance to come on his own terms, and because he refused it, the galaxy was forced to suffer. The Force had to endure pain, and now there was no longer a choice. His actions had gone too far. They led to the creation of the Empire, First Order, and Final Order. Sidious was far too powerful to remain alive. Its success would submit generations into terror and subjugation. Rey was silent. She had been ever since the priestesses arrived. She looked at them and then to Anakin. She at this point had come to the conclusion that her life was going to end. She was content with it, truthfully. The whole reason for going to Exegol was so that she could kill her grandfather. When she realized that striking him down in anger would allow him to possess her, she understood it would take her sacrifice to end the Sith. It was scary. At 20 years old, she was forced to surrender her life to the Force so that the balance may return. However, she knew that as long as her friends could have the peace they fought so hard to attain, then it would be worth it. How could she not understand the commitment she was about to make? Her teachers were the greatest instructors the Jedi ever had, at least from her point of view. Luke's sacrifice at the Battle of Crate didn't just inspire the galaxy, but it heralded in a new beginning for the Jedi. What Luke was able to accomplish did wonders for the galaxy. Both his first and final act in his life inspired a galaxy left hopeless in the face of oppression. When he destroyed the Death Star, and when he saved the Resistance, he inspired 2 whole generations worth of freedom fighters. Her own teacher, Leia, was just as incredible. She taught Rey the true meaning of becoming a Jedi, and in her final act, she sacrificed herself to save her son, to bring him back to the light. It was a year-long journey for Ben, but through a mother's love, Solo returned. The year started with the death of his father and Luke's sacrifice, and with his mother there to aid him in his return to the light, Rey understood what it truly meant. Her masters taught her that confronting fear was a destiny of the Jedi, and she was prepared for this undertaking, one that would include her very own death. The Force priestesses required their sacrifice, and she was willing and ready to go. Anakin was afraid to let go of his wife, who was the only person on his mind in the moment. Serenity called out to Anakin and told him that this journey was required by both of them. If he did not complete it, he would be causing his wife to die. But Padme wouldn't be the only sacrifice. His children, Luke and Leia, would be killed as well. The galaxy would be enslaved, and darkness would take rule of a broken galaxy. She asked if that was what he truly desired for them. For Rey, it all clicked. She turned to him, calling him Anakin Skywalker. His eyes looked to her, and he nodded his head. Leia didn't talk much about her father, and in the time she knew Luke, he didn't bring up Anakin. Anakin looked at Rey as she told him that he might not know it, but his children were the inspiration for a new Jedi Order. Without them, the galaxy might be lost. Anakin came down a little lower from his Mustafar rage, and he looked at her. Rey's optimism was so vibrant. He didn't want to let go. She looked at him for a bit with confusion, asking him why he wouldn't let go. He told her that he had so much here, the love of his life was here. If he left her behind, then he'd have nothing. But he wasn't understanding. They weren't coming back. They had to let go and give themselves over to the Force. It may have not been their choice to be the chosen one or chosen ones, but they had to do what was necessary for the greater good of the galaxy. That was their purpose. Anakin looked back to the priestesses and asked if something could be done so they could come back to life. Sadness came forward and told him that his choices reflected his reality. For the survival of the Force, it was their destiny. Rey and Anakin looked towards each other before she inquisitively asked what happened when they died. Rey was familiar with the concept of Force ghosts, and she remembered what they said about guardians or being guardians. Serenity said that once they brought balance to the Force, they'd become one with it and become guardians of the world between worlds. They would teach their successors how to continue forward. They'd be comfort for their students and family as she looked to Anakin, and they'd be comfort for their friends as she looked to Rey. The path was ahead of them. The priestesses moved out of the way as the 2 portals into 2 different times appeared. Rey and Anakin looked in. On the right side from where Anakin came in, they could see Sidious defeating Grandmaster Yoda in combat. On the left side where Rey came in, they could see where Sidious was tearing down the fleet of freedom fighters. The priestesses told them to go quickly, so they could save the Force and their friends. Anakin and Rey stepped forward. He took a deep breath, his anger subsiding, realizing that he needed to make this choice. They stepped past each other, and Anakin turned back to Rey, wishing for the Force to be with her. A radiant smile crossed her face as she wished the same for him. They both went in their separate ways and left. Rey dropped down onto a platform, her skin filled with heat as she looked over to a man on the top of a hill. He looked stressed and then confused. Rey held her hands upwards in front of her shoulders. She asked who he was. Kenobi was just as confused, but she was able to quickly dismount. Kenobi asked who she was, and she told him that her name was Rey. Obi-Wan told her that he was Obi-Wan Kenobi. She then asked if he was related to an old Ben Kenobi. He looked at her questioningly, and then thought of the nickname Satine gave him. He hadn't really ever considered using it, but perhaps he would? He was trying to understand who she was, but she was adamant that they find Palpatine. She was here to stop him. Kenobi looked back down to see if he could find Anakin. He just disappeared, which was kind of weird. Obi-Wan told her that they just need to get off this world, and they could talk about everything. Kenobi was worried about his friend Padme, which was why he was urging Rey to come with him. He didn't know who she was, and she was somehow more familiar with him than she was Anakin. This was mostly due to Leia's feelings about him compared to her actual father. After everything was situated, Rey and Obi-Wan sat down inside the cockpit area of the Naboo starship, and he asked her who she was or how she got here. Truthfully, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, but considering Obi-Wan had encountered some weird occurrences within the Force, it wasn't the most far-fetched thing to believe, though he wanted to know more about where she was coming from and what was happening. She did too. They would discuss the most important things of each other's lives. While Rey was familiar with the Clone Wars, she wasn't knowledgeable on it. The war ended nearly 50 years before she was born. Being on Jakku didn't elicit history courses on the Clone Wars either. All the knowledge she had of any of that came from her master. All the other knowledge she obtained from the wreckages on Jakku. Kenobi understood that Rey was a Jedi, and the last of the Jedi truthfully, though who were Luke and Leia Skywalker. Rey was a bit unsure, but she believed that they were the twins about to be born from Padme. It was so convoluted and Obi-Wan didn't really know how to process it, but he told her that he was a general, the Sith had won, and the Jedi were likely to go into hiding. Rey shook her head. She was adamant that they needed to defeat Sidious. That's why she was here. She spent so much time searching for her purpose, and if her purpose was indeed sacrificing herself, then she was willing to accept it. Kenobi admired her attitude, but there's so much to understand about this situation. The key difference between the Palpatine of her era and the one of this era was that the Emperor of the Galaxy was spanning a government that just won a 3-year war. There was little he could do wrong in the public eye, which meant that killing him would negate him. Another individual would rise to his position, in other words. The issue was no one could expose him, because no one had access. With Yoda having failed, they needed to strategize their approach. Rey and Obi-Wan arrived at Polis Massa and rushed Padme to a medical wing where she's able to give a healthy birth. Sidious, on the other hand, was confused at the fact that Anakin had just vanished. He assumed that he betrayed him, when in reality, he was in a completely different era. Rey was very focused on the end goal of defeating Sidious. Her worry for what her grandfather was capable of was terrifying. Then it slowly started to dawn on her. It made sense, it was just hard to grasp. But the Empire, the one that was left behind on Jakku, was the same Empire she was watching rise at this very moment. It was hard to wrap her mind around. There's so much confusion and stress. Everything she felt through the Force was so dark, so much worse than what she was used to. The First Order had its grasp on the galaxy, to an extent, but as shown by the Battle of Exegol, Luke's sacrifice hit home with a lot of people. There was none of that here. The galaxy was reeling. The more she learned, the more she was horrified and disgusted and ashamed. Her heart hurt, and then she met Grandmaster Yoda, who was present on Polis Massa, who was defeated by Sidious. She was confused. Her grandfather, the one she met, was attached to a life support system, and was suspended from the air. He wasn't more than a man, but apparently not here. As Padme was taken care of, Rey learned about this new era, and how the Sith had risen. Yoda was entirely on board with her being here. His interaction with the priestesses of the Force made him understand that part of this was a burden to bear. As a Grand Master, he should hold himself responsible, and he was. But if Rey was indeed here to help bring balance to the Force, then she needed to be ready. Fighting the Sith Lord would not be easy. As Obi-Wan walked into the medical room to take care of Padme and be by her side as her friend, Yoda asked Rey what kind of training she had received. She informed the Grand Master that she trained with only 2 masters from her era. She spent a full year with Leia and the text from Ahch-To, hoping that he might know what she was referring to. Yoda knew all too well. The books on Ahch-To were not page-turners. He chuckled at the notion of her having read books from that temple. There were copies of them inside the restricted section inside his temple in Coruscant. They held information on Sith Wayfinders, Force Heal, and a number of other abilities and tidbits of knowledge. Rey knelt down to the Grand Master and she told him that she had a terrible truth to inform him. Yoda looked at her with concern as she told him that she was a granddaughter of Palpatine. Her father was a non-Force sensitive clone, and her mother had something special about her. Rey didn't know what that was, and she didn't know her mother long enough. Truthfully, learning that Rey was a descendant of Palpatine was worrying. But then he realized that she wasn't anything like him. Obviously, he had not seen her fury as of yet. All of her faults came when she used the darkness that so easily came from her grandfather. But if she was dedicated to destroying Palpatine, then she needed to be ready. At 20 years old, she needed more time, especially if she was going to be confronting the Dark Lord in a lightsaber contest. Perhaps in the Force it'd be different, but Yoda struggled in lightsaber combat, so he needed to pass on what he had learned. It was difficult for Yoda. He was prepared to go into exile, but upon speaking to Rey, her youthful energy reminded him of one of his first teachers. They told Yoda to pass on what he had learned. It had been so long since he last thought of her, and as he looked to Rey, he remembered, pass on what he had learned. Strength, mastery, yes, but also weakness, folly, failure. Most of all, failure. The greatest teacher failure was. If he neglected to finish Rey's training, then the galaxy would be doomed to become what she was left to fight for. If in 3 generations they were fighting the same Sith Lord, then it was time. The sound of crying caught their attention as they turned to see the fabled Jedi Masters Rey mentioned. They were nothing but infants, so adorable and pleasant. Without knowledge of the future, they were left to fight for. Rey told Yoda that she was ready to learn, and she wanted to. If she didn't know, she was eager to learn it. For Leia, it's what made her such an easy student. She was always eager to learn, and it was the refining of her talents that added to her great potential. In the moment, it was decided that Bail would take the twins to Alderaan, as Obi-Wan and Yoda took Rey to Tython. On their way there, she expressed that her master had been teaching her to call out to all the Jedi. Obi-Wan didn't understand, but Yoda did. Leia was teaching her student to call out to all the Jedi of the past. All of them existed in the living Force. This was not the Netherworld. While some of those living within the Force could return as Force ghosts, most of them had just passed on. Qui-Gon was a part of the Netherworld of the Force, which permitted him to return. However, Master Windu had no knowledge of how to transcend to the Netherworld, which is why he was within the living Force, a member of it, as all Jedi were. Yoda told her that he believed Leia saw her potential, and she believed that Rey would be able to carry on the name of not just the Jedi, but her family. To connect with all the Jedi in a moment was what a true Jedi was meant to do. If they could find home with those from before, then they could be truly unstoppable. Rey admitted that she'd been having a lot of difficulty connecting with them, but Yoda was reassuring to the notion that she'd be able to do it. Obi-Wan was learning so much at the same time. He was familiar with a couple of these concepts, but most of what Yoda was talking about is what he learned when he was out on his secret missions. Rey knew of it because of Luke and Leia. Obi-Wan had yet to learn of Qui-Gon's Force Ghost away from their interaction on Mortis. When they arrived on Tython, they continued Rey's training right where Leia left off. Luke used Form 5 and Leia used a mixture of Form 4 and 5. However, due to the age of both instructors, Rey had no one to teach her a specific form of lightsaber combat, a true distinction between eras. In the Clone Wars, it was all about using lightsaber forms. In the era of the New Republic, it was what information both Skywalkers acquired, considering it wasn't quite the official doctrine that was Yoda's order. Ben Solo used fundamentals of Form 5, but the gaps in his form were filled with a mixture of 1 and 2. For Rey, it was relatively similar. With the addition of her entire life using a weapon to defend herself from thugs and assaults on Jakku, she developed her own twist on the form. When the 2 Jedi worked with her, they realized that she stylized her blade around a couple forms, but nothing was directly one form. This was likely due to her using the text from Octo 2 and her instruction with Leia. Being that Leia wasn't limber enough to spar with Rey, Rey was never able to break free from her lifelong fighting pattern. And despite using a staff, it did translate over really well into using a lightsaber. This left Yoda and Obi-Wan with a dilemma. If they broke her out of her current form, it would take her longer. However, if they added to it, she might end up creating her own self-sustained form of the blade. They inevitably went with the latter, using what she knew and building off of it, which in a way forced Kenobi and Yoda to adopt a more Boken-like instruction for Rey. With Kenobi masterful in both Form 4 and 3, he was able to spar with Rey on a regular basis, which really helped her settle down into her own lightsaber form. It did help that she used the blade that was passed down to her from her master, a beautifully designed lightsaber, one replicated after the first Jedi Leia ever met. It was odd for Obi-Wan to see how influential he became in Leia's life when she was only just born moments ago. During their training, Padme, Luke, and Leia would join them on Tython, due to the Emperor sending out death squads to find Padme and her children. Because Rey was so dedicated to learning and so focused on understanding what it was that Yoda and Obi-Wan were teaching her, she was able to progress through her training rapidly. Having used her grandfather's powers on Pasaana, she had a vague understanding of the darkness that existed within her. Though with the help of Yoda and Kenobi, she was able to face one of the greatest fears, which was herself. Mixed in with the imposter syndrome and the other internal conflicts she was facing, she was terrified of becoming her grandfather. She knew why she was here and what her mission was, but she couldn't handle the prospect of turning into him, becoming the Emperor and sitting on his throne. Having experienced Exegol and seen it, it haunted her most nights on Tython. She was able to find an inkling of peace though. When she wasn't training as hard as she was when she was with Leia, she was with Padme and the twins. A realization crossed her mind since she had been here in this new era. Defeating Sidious here meant that she could save Anakin's family, and the same went for him, her family, the only people she called home, being Finn, Poe, Rose, and Ben. They could be saved by Anakin. It gave an extra sense of motivation. In a weird way, she and Skywalker were here to not just save the universe, but each other's family. No pressure, right? Over the span of a year and a half, Rey would adopt what would be called Form 9, Way of the Guardian, or in Jedi speak, Jianu Shi. It combined her greatest strengths in lightsaber usage. On the other hand, due to her desire to continue learning, Rey adopted a number of Force abilities she had been unaware of up until this point. Yoda and Obi-Wan were proud of her progression, and when the time came, they knew they could strike. Bail and Padme were ready. They had since collected evidence that could destroy Palpatine's image. All they needed was for him to be killed off. Rey's first task before confronting the Emperor would be an accidental encounter with the Grand Inquisitor and the Fifth Brother. The duel was flashy. Rey used Leia's lightsaber as her own, and used her aggressive stylized form against the two opponents. Due to the form having some unique moves that were created by Rey, Yoda, and Obi-Wan, she was able to defeat the two Inquisitors. She had come into a fuller balance within herself, though that wasn't to say she didn't have a slip-up or two. Though one of her biggest struggles, especially during her last fight with Kylo Ren, was stamina, and she was able to get on top of that here. She believed that there was still so much more to learn, however, she knew that she was ready for this encounter. Both Yoda and Obi-Wan believed in her, and were ready to be there with her through this. They had everything set. Palpatine would be in the Emperor's mansion, which was far away from the most trooper locations on Coruscant. The only worry were potential Inquisitorius members, but with Grand Inquisitor and Fifth Brother dead, their units were spread out looking for the Jedi who did it. The three Jedi arrived to the planet of Coruscant, and Rey was in awe. She had never seen anything like it before. It was a reminder to both Obi-Wan and Yoda of her age. Despite the childlike innocence about Rey, she was still more focused on her path as a Jedi than seeking adventure. Of course, she wanted to see these wondrous cities, environments, and planets, but she understood what was important in her own era, and that would be the same in this one. She looked at the city and then internalized how important this was. She knew how much was on the line. They could not fail. However, after seeing a city of 3 trillion sentients, it just put the perspective into her own eyes. She could see probably a million or so. Oh, well, look at that, a skyscraper. She smiled to herself, and then she came back to the moment. The Jedi landed not far away from the mansion, and they prepared themselves. Before they left, Rey stopped both Jedi. They were so much more orthodox than her personal instructors. They sugar-coated things in ways that Luke and Leia didn't. But just as her teachers did, they believed in her. That meant more than anything to her. She recalled that Master Skywalker said that some things were stronger than blood. They knew that she was a Palpatine, and the fact that they trusted her and helped her meant the galaxy to her. This task was an undertaking unlike any other, only a year and a half older than she was before she arrived, and prepared to face her grandfather at the peak of his power. Obi-Wan and Yoda told her she had everything she needed. It was a very delicate moment, and it was perfect. Rey was still trying to get in contact with the Jedi, and it was still a struggle for her, but she trusted the Force and all of her masters. They went into the mansion and waited. The Sith Lord was in the Senate building, and likely would be back soon. Rey situated herself in a quiet place and continued calling out into the Force, asking that the Jedi be with her. Yoda told her about Qui-Gon and the Netherworld and the Living Force, but she had yet to hear from them. It would be alright, she would find it. In time, she would find it. Hours passed by, and then the darkness enveloped the mansion. She could feel her grandfather. He came in and he could sense her too. The family bond made her immediately recognizable, even though he didn't know she even existed. So she came out and confronted him. He asked her who she was, and she told him that she was his granddaughter, and she was here to end his evil legacy. Sidious was quick on his feet, telling her that despite what the Jedi who brought her here thought, she would die. He was hoping that would persuade her to join him on the throne. Not knowing who she was or anything else, he could sense her essence, and it was vibrant, just like Skywalker's. She told her to forgo the Jedi way. They wouldn't be able to promise her immortality like he could. Obi-Wan and Yoda, afraid of her being convinced to join, jumped out. They ignited their weapons, and Sidious smiled. Rey didn't budge. She just looked at her grandfather. Sidious couldn't feel the tension, as if she had gone through this exercise with him before. What was this? Sidious felt like this was some sort of illusion. As he acted dazed and confused, he ripped panels off the wall and flung them against Obi-Wan's and Yoda's backs. He wanted Rey. She'd be the easiest to either kill or turn. She appeared to be in her young 20s. Rey, without missing a beat, ignited her Jedi weapon, and Sidious examined it, walking closer. Rey was on edge, her thoughts on what Palpatine said to her in Exegol. She was afraid of striking him down because if it was in anger, then all of this would be for nothing. He approached her and she pointed the blade at him, and he asked his granddaughter why she was so afraid of taking her place. This put her into a daunting position. She didn't know what would happen if she struck him down in anger. Would that undo everything she was meant to do? She wasn't angry, but she was afraid of being angry. Sidious toyed with her until the other Jedi returned to their feet, and his lightsabers ignited. A massive duel started. Rey, Yoda, and Obi-Wan engaged Sidious. He was flashy as ever, and he was taking advantage of each Jedi. His mansion was filled with dark artifacts that made them weaker, so all it took was them being here for them to lose their power in the Force. They got weaker the longer they were in the building, and having been here for hours, they were already dampened. Sidious moved flawlessly, and each one of the 3 Jedi were struggling, the darkness hampering their movements and their attempts to defeat him as well. He flung the Jedi like they were nothing, but his focus came back to Rey, telling her that she wouldn't escape this fate. She looked at her instructors as they kept getting beat back, and she closed her eyes. She spoke to herself quietly as Sidious pulled his lightsaber back in front of him, after shoving Kenobi to the ground again. He told her that she would join, or she would die. Her lightsaber dropped out of her hands and she became still, almost deathly still. As Sidious closed in, Rey felt a chill roll down her spine. She could feel it. Windu, Luminara, Yaddle, Bastila, Sifo Dyas, Plo, Depa Balaba, Jedi from the past, they were all with her in this moment. She could feel them the moment they arrived. Sidious shrugged, telling her that she would die. Not long after, so would her friends. Rey's eyes opened as Sidious's blade growled towards her. The weapon stopped a few inches from her neck. She pulled her hand backwards to the tip of the blade. Sidious looked at his granddaughter. She could feel the darkness inside the crimson blade. Her eyes opened and she pushed the blade back into the hilt. Sidious was confused, and then he could feel heat from the hilt of the blade. Rey twisted her hands before her and squinted her face. With the darkness impeding her, trying to pull her in, she resisted. She created an implosion within the blade, and with all the Jedi behind her, she made sure her teachers didn't die. They were the future. Her chest heaved gently as she took one final deep breath. The lightsaber exploded in Sidious's hand, and the radius of the lightsaber explosion could have killed them all, but it only incinerated Palpatine. His body melted under the heat and pressure as he was subsequently killed by his granddaughter. When he died, ashes fell to the ground. Rey stumbled forward, having used so much strength in the light, with pure light, to resist the darkness of this building, and the power of her grandfather took so much from her. Rey fell to her knees and held herself up with her hands. Obi-Wan and Yoda came quickly to her side and held her. She took a deep breath. She'd be lying if she said she wasn't a little scared, but it was done. This was for them. She smiled, thanking them kindly, as she could feel the world between worlds pulling her in. Before she let go of the present world, she spoke to both masters, telling them to never lose faith in the Force. As they tried to comfort her, she vanished into the Force, becoming one with it. Rey felt all the fear consume her, and then in a split second it vanished, and her strength returned, as she was able to press herself off the ground. She looked up and smiled. There he was. Anakin was no longer holding a serious scowl. He had a warm and welcoming smile. Rey's face grew with a heartfelt smile, and her eyes watered. Both her and Anakin realized that their own respective families were safe. They had saved the galaxy, and they brought balance to the Force. The two of them walked towards each other, picking up pace a little bit faster before meeting in the middle, embracing each other in a large, warm, and peaceful hug. There was no anger, no sorrow, no pain, and only peace. They could hear a couple voices around them. While it had been a good amount of time for them, for the priestesses of the Force, it had only been a couple of moments. Serenity spoke up and told them that they had brought balance to the Force. Behind her came Joy, telling them that they should be proud of the work they did. Anger came forward, expressing that the path forward was one of timelessness. Confusion followed her, speaking about the potential their bond could mean for future generations. Sadness came behind and said that while their immortal journey was complete, their eternal one had just begun. Rey and Anakin looked to each other with large smiles as they turned back to the priestesses, who spun and spun and spun before vanishing before their very eyes. They were now both guardians of the world between worlds. They'd have their time to share their stories with each other, and they'd be able to look on at their families as they continued life together in their new galaxies full of peace. However, the time would come that as guardians, they would have to instruct others. When that time did come, both Rey and Anakin would tell those individuals about a story that came a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the Star Wars Galaxies for joining us on this collaboration. If you want Anakin's perspective, go check him out. Sick video. Anyway, special thanks to the patrons: Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Vanity Bane, Cullen Rooney, The Last Jedi, Apollo Weewu 670, Annika Stankrunner, CT7567, Azavaz, Darth Noxley, Trinal Padawan, Joshua Dem, John Ndaguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Geek Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngly Slayer 66, Mad Minutes News, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Photos Like See Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, the Man with 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash the like button. If you want to see some behind the scenes content or support me in other ways, go check out the Patreon. Sith Clone Wars every Saturday, like this Saturday, and animation updates. Anyways, let's talk about the story. So, taking Palpatine out of the story, like killing him off in both eras, allows this actually to work pretty fluently. Obviously, some things will be different, but in a way, Leia will still be influenced by Obi-Wan, and she still might call Ben if she has a kid with Han Solo. And so it allows everything to actually naturally transpire the way it does without interrupting the timeline anyways. But I really like this. I love talking about Rey. I love doing stories with Rey, so this was a super fun collaboration to do. I want to do more sequel content, so leave some ideas down below that aren't rewrite the sequels, because I'm not going to do those. Anyways, thank you Galaxy for joining us on this awesome collaboration. Go check them out. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.